Hello, boys and girls. Mrs. Blackburn here for our writing lesson this week. We are going to be working and reviewing poetry. So today we're going to begin with the elements of poetry and our learning goal. Students will describe the author's use of imagery, literal and figurative language such as simile and metaphor, and other sound devices. Your success criteria: I can successfully identify the 5 elements of poetry. So let's go ahead and begin. The 5 elements of poetry. The 5 elements of poetry overview. The first element that we will be discussing is figurative language. The second one will be imagery. The third one, voice. Fourth one, ideas and content. And the fifth one, word choice. Hopefully these are starting to sound familiar to you and you can say, yes, I know what these are. Some of these are the 6 traits of writing, and you can see how they cross over into the elements of poetry. The first one, figurative language. Alliteration is one of the figurative language devices that we'll be discussing. This technique is using words that begin with the same letter. For example, 5 funny firemen found fish. She eagerly eats enormous eggs. So you can see the same beginning sound is used over and over at the same time. This again is called alliteration. Sometimes we call these tongue twisters, and they're fun to say, they're fun to memorize. Again, that's alliteration. Another element of poetry that is often used in this figurative language is called hyperbole. Hyperboles are huge exaggerations that are obviously not true. We used hyperboles a lot when we created and read tall tales, like Paul Bunyan. That was one example that we read together in our IRAs, and then we wrote the Wicked Weather tall tales together. Here's an example. I told you 1,000,000 times not to jump on the bed. You may have heard that from one of your parents or your guardians, and obviously someone hasn't told you that 1,000,000 times. That's an exaggeration, but they may have told you many times. Again, that's a hyperbole. Another example of figurative language that you will see oftentimes in poetry is called an idiom. An idiom is using words or phrases that could have more than one meaning. An example is a penny saved is a penny earned. Benjamin Franklin was often known for saying that, or it's a piece of cake. Both of those are sayings that we often say, and they don't have the literal meaning. It doesn't actually mean that it's literally a piece of cake. This is where our literal and our figurative language come into play. This is figurative language, and it is called an idiom. So when someone says it's a piece of cake, they actually mean that it's something that's very simple or easy to do. And a penny saved is a penny earned means that if you save a penny or you save some money, then you've actually earned some more money. You have money in savings. Another example of figurative language, which is one of the elements of poetry, is a metaphor. Metaphors combine or compare two things and show how they are alike or different. Typically, metaphors are things that are not similar at all. Remember, they do not use like or as, and they're direct comparisons. For example, he is a giant. Her eyes were sparklers in the night. They are direct comparisons, and they do not use the words like or as. That's a metaphor. Onomatopoeia is another example of figurative language that you often see in poetry. The literary technique of using words that sound like the example, like the word. For example, swoosh, zing, sizzle, thump, clank, bonk, shh, pow, zip. Oftentimes you'll see these words in comic books or graphic novels. So these words sound just like their meaning. That's called onomatopoeia. That's another fun word to say. Personification is another example of figurative language. Personification has the word person at the beginning, and I like to tell my students that this is where it actually is a word that takes on human or characteristics of a person. So it's a type of metaphor where human characteristics are given to non-human things. For example, the forest spoke to me. The forest isn't a person, but they're saying the forest spoke to me. So that's where the forest is acting like a person. So we call that personification. Okay, next we have our simile. This is an example of figurative language. Similes are special kinds of metaphors. Similes use like or as to compare things. So again, they're just like a metaphor, except they have that word like or as in them. She swims like a fish. He is sly as a fox. Okay, now we're going to the next element of poetry. We're not on figurative language anymore. We are now discussing imagery. An image is a picture. Good writers use imagery to paint pictures with their words in the reader's mind. When poems are well written, your sense of sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing are affected. Great writers choose words that create imagery in the reader's mind. So you know you've read something really wonderful if they have tapped into your sight, smell, taste, and touch and hearing. That's called imagery. Okay, the next element of poetry is called voice. This can also be used in your regular writing as well, the same with imagery, but in particular it's used with poetry. Poems are meant to be shared and read out loud. Poems with voice speak to the reader. Poems can rhyme and often sound like lyrics to a song. Sometimes alliteration is used to create patterns, repetition, and rhythm. Poetry can create feelings that generate emotion and cause the reader or listener to feel something. So when they can do that, that's called voice. Element number 4 in poetry is called ideas and content. Well-written poems have great ideas and content, just like good books, and make the reader think. The ideas are important to help express the main ideas to the reader and come from the heart of the writer. They're also very well developed. And finally, our 5th element of poetry is called word choice. Since poems tend to be shorter in length, it is important to choose words for your poems carefully. Use words that get right to the point and paint a picture in the reader's mind. Haiku poems are a good example of this since they are only made up of 17 syllables. All right, so in conclusion, there are 5 elements of poetry: figurative language, imagery, voice, ideas, and content, and then finally, word choice. So those are the 5 elements of poetry that we need to make sure that we are including. We will be discussing poetry the rest of this week and reviewing it, and then you will have time to practice writing poetry of your own. Today we will be reviewing in a puzzle piece these 5 elements of poetry and making sure that we know them really well. And then starting tomorrow, we will delve into a particular type of poetry, and then you'll practice writing your own. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and I look forward to hearing and speaking with you tomorrow.